Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Mirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Yud Tes Amud Aleph. We are holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on Kuf Yud Ches Amud Beis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 lines off the bottom line in the Shulchan Aruch, Siman Shin Yud Gimel Sif Dalid, where we are continuing to learn the halachas of Boine being Moisif al Habinyan, what's problematic, what's not. We've been discussing so far a lot of cases that have to do with closing doors. When we close a door, do we see that in any way as making a hisafa al Habinyan? Do we see that what you're actually doing is making an addition to the structure? After all, a door is essentially an opening in the wall. When you take something and you put it into that opening to close it, in a sense, there is a makam to look at it as if you're making a hisafa al habinyan. You're closing up a gap in the wall, so you're adding something to the structure. Adding something to a structure would definitely be a problem of boina, so that's what we've been discussing over here. Our learning today should be a schus for Achenu Kobeis Yisrael and Asudim Batzar B'Shivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom U'Bein B'Yabasha Ha'makim Yirachem Aleihem V'Yitzim Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afel L'Oira Mishib L'Geula Hashta B'Agala V'Zman Kuriv and Emar Amein. Our learning should be a schus for Fuhr Shalema from Moshe Ben Esther Fradl Yitzchak Ben Tzion Ben Dusha Rafal Yisrael Menachem Ben Ita Genendel Chavadasa B'Aserel. They should have a Fuhr Shalema B'Sai Shar Chel Yisrael. Our learning should be a schus for Yonason Ben Michal and Yoel Ben Michal. The Rabbeinu Shalom should watch over them together with all of our other brothers and sisters who find themselves in harm's way. Okay, now here in Sif Dalid, the Mechaber is going to turn his attention to a doorway that is frequently used. In Sif Gimel, we spoke about a doorway that went to the backyard storage area, the Rechava She'achorei Habatim, otherwise known, I've said, as the Muktzah. The Gemara in Eruvin often refers to it as the Muktzah. That was a storage area in the back. It's not a place that people frequently went to. So in Sif Gimel, we spoke about a case where you had a very infrequently used doorway. And once in a blue moon, less frequently than every 30 days, you would want to open up this opening to be able to go out and come back in, and then you would close it up again. So there's a more significant shaila of Tosefes al Habinyan, because when you close it, it's going to remain closed for a lengthy period of time. Here in Sif Dalid, we're going to turn our attention to more of a regular doorway. This is a doorway that is used frequently. Now, the Mechaber is not going to spell that out, but we're going to see that in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's read the Mechaber, though, with that understanding. Says the Mechaber Sif Dalid, Deles, a door, and we're talking about a door in a frequently used doorway. But this Deles, this door, is a very atypical door. The door itself is an atypical door. Deles ha'osoi miluach echad, a door that was formed out of one board. Apparently, this was not the derech. Usually, a door was built out of multiple planks that were fastened together. So maybe you had, let's say, 4 or 5 vertical planks, and then you had cross beams nailed onto it to hold the vertical planks together. That was more the typical construction of a door. But here, you have an atypical door. This door is a luach echad. It's one single board. Deles ha'osei biluach echad, oi she'ein lo askufa hatachtoina. Now, the words of the Mechaber mean or. Oi, the word oi, usually means or. So it would be that the Mechaber is saying one of two situations. Either the door is atypical because it's one board instead of being constructed out of multiple planks, or the doorway is atypical. What's atypical about the doorway? It does not have an askufa tachtoina. The askufa tachtoina is the threshold, the saddle at the bottom of the doorway that was spoken about already previously. Now that's if you take the words of the Mechaber literally. The Mishnah Berurah is going to point out that the Rambam doesn't say that. The Rambam says this halacha in the context of having both of these atypical situations. You have a door, which is an atypical door because it's one solitary board, and the doorway that the door is being used to close is an atypical doorway in that it does not have the askufa tachtoina. It doesn't have a threshold at the base of the doorway. So with this understanding, let's read the Mechaber again from the beginning. Deles, you have a door, which is atypical because it's ha'osli miluach echad. It's made from one board. Let's learn it like the Rambam. Also, the doorway is atypical because it does not have a threshold at the bottom. Now, another variable. Ukishepoischim, also, when you open this doorway, shemtim oisa, you remove the door, va'oikrim oisa, and you put it away. So, what does that mean? This door is not connected to the structure. We learned previously about doorways that were tied to the structure. They were hanging by a rope attached to the structure. This door is not attached to the structure. It's not tied to the structure. So now let's put all of these variables together. We have a doorway that is frequently used. Maybe it's the regular front door of the house. This is a doorway that is very frequently used. However, the door that's used to close it up is an atypical door because it's also miluach echad. It's one board. Also, the doorway itself is atypical because it doesn't have an askufa tachtoina. And another variable, which is problematic, is that the door is not affixed to the house in any way. It's not tied to the house. When you remove it and you put it away. And when you want to put it back, you take it and you go ahead and you put it back. Says the Mechaber, what's the halacha over here? Ein noyalimba. You're not allowed to close this doorway, and this is true, says the Mechaber, afilu yesh lotzir. Even if the door does have one of the trappings of a proper door, it has a pivot, still you're not allowed to close this door. So what's at work over here? The problem over here, again, becomes a problem of Tosefes al Habinyan. Because this door is an atypical door, it's just one board, and because the doorway is atypical, it doesn't have an askufa tachtoina, and furthermore, you have another problem, that this door is not affixed to the structure in any way, so when you remove it, you really remove it. You remove it and you put it away in the corner, and then when you want to put it back, you take it and you put it back into the doorway. All of these problematic variables arrive at a conclusion where when you close this doorway, it looks like you're being Moisef Alabinyan. It doesn't look like you're closing a door, which is made to be opened and closed and opened and closed. That's not what it looks like. Does this look like a doorway? No, it doesn't have an askufa tachtoina. So it looks like it's just an opening in the wall. The door, does it look like a door? No, it looks like a sheet of plywood. So you know what this looks like? This looks like you have a breach in the wall. You have an opening in the wall that's really not supposed to be there. And you're taking a sheet of plywood. You're not taking like a door, which is tied to the house to be used as a door. No, you're taking a sheet of plywood and you're sticking it into the opening and you're closing the opening. So this really looks like Tosefes Alabinyan, and it doesn't look like a Tosefes Arai. It looks like a real Tosefes. It looks like you're taking a sheet of plywood and you're closing up a breach in the wall. And therefore, says the Mechaber, ein noyalim ba, you're not allowed to close this doorway on Shabbos. And this is true even if there's one mitigating factor. Even if the door does have a pivot, so epis, it looks like a door, still, says the Mechaber, you're not allowed to close this doorway. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah over here. Ois Katan Lamed Aleph. Ois Katan Lamed. Deles ha'osli miluach echad, says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu, what's the problem here? Lefi she'ein lo tekune hadeles kishar delosos. Since this doesn't have the trappings of a door, hevik istima ba'alma. It looks like you're just closing a breach. V'nira kabaina. And it looks mamish like binyan. Umayri kan, and this is what I told you at the beginning of this year. Umayri kan, and the Mechaber is discussing over here a case. Afilu bepesach ha'osli l'knisa v'yitziat tadir. This halacha is true despite the fact that this is a doorway which is frequently used. Doesn't matter. You don't have a door that looks like a door. You don't have a doorway that looks like a doorway. It's not tied to the house. Again, it looks like there's a breach in the wall, and you're taking a sheet of plywood and you're closing it up, and that you cannot do on Shabbos. Oiskan Lamed Aleph, Miluach Echad. You have this door is made out of one board, and the words of the Mechaber were, Oy she'ein lo yaskufa tachtoina. Or it doesn't have a lower threshold. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what I spoke out, V'das Rambam, it's the opinion of the Rambam, the loy aser ela betarti l'reusa. In order for it to be aser to close this doorway, you need both problematic variables. You need that the door is not a proper door, because it's one board, and you need also that the doorway doesn't have an askufa tachtoina. Dahainu shehu miluach echad, v'gam ein lo askufa. Ubepesach also liknisa v'yitzia tadir lamaisa, says the Mishnah Berurah, when we're talking about a doorway that is frequently used, mitzadidim ha'achrayim, the achrayim take the position, d'yesh lismaich al shitase lahakel. You could rely on this opinion of the Rambam, and you could go lekula. So if you have a doorway that is frequently used, and you only have one of the problematic variables, like the door is an atypical door because it's also miluach echad, but there is an askufa tachtaina, or the other way, or it's a proper door, it's made out of multiple planks, but the doorway is atypical because it doesn't have an askufa tachtaina. In those cases, you would be allowed to close the door. Oiskat Lamed Beis, the Mechaber said, Ukisha Poischen Oisa, when you open this doorway, in the words of the Mechaber, Shoimtin Oisa, you remove the door, Va'oikrim Oisa, and you put it away. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kat Lamed Beis, Mashma Mized, Umayri B'She'ena Keshura. It seems that the Mechaber means here, when he says that when you open the door, you remove the door, Va'oikrim Oisa, you remove it and you separate it, it means that it's not even tied to the structure. Aval imhi keshura utluya. But if this door would be tied with a rope to the house, even if it's hanging from the house with a long rope, so that it lays on the ground when you open it, then it would be mutter to close this door, even though the door is an atypical door and the doorway is an improper doorway. The reason we would be makel over here is because lamaisa, this is a doorway that is frequently used. That's a mitigating factor. When you're dealing with a doorway that's frequently used, there's less of a tzad to say that this is a real Tosefes Alabinyan. What do you mean? I'm not closing it up. We use this all the time. Ice cotton. Did we do this yet? No, we didn't do this yet. Now we go to the Ramah, 4 lines for the bottom, last word on the line, Hago. Aval delas ha'asuya mikrashim harbe. But if you have a proper door, you have a door that's made out of multiple planks, shari, then it would be mutter to close the doorway, even though the door is not tied to the house and you remove it totally when you open it, im yeshla askufa, so long as it has an askufa tachtoina. So what the Ramah is saying over here is, if it's a proper door and it's a proper doorway because there is an askufa tachtoina, so here you have all of the trappings of a doorway, which is meant to be open and closed, and you have the trappings of a door. It's a door that's made out of multiple planks, so it looks like a door. It doesn't look like a sheet of plywood that you're looking to close it up. In that case, says the Ramah, it would be mutter to close the door. What's the chiddush? Despite the fact that the door is not tied to the house. That's the one problematic variable. The door is not tied to the house. Meaning that it's not in any way tied to the house. Now, points out the Mishnah Berurah that you might think that there's an inconsistency here between Sif Dalet and Sif Gimel, but there isn't. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'afagav de Bereish Sif Gimel, in the beginning of Sif Gimel, Bedelas Shel Rechava, by the doorway that goes to the backyard, Shegam hi mistama asuya kishar delosos. In Sif Gimel, when we spoke about the doorway going to the backyard, the infrequently used doorway, we didn't say anything about the construction of the door. The assumption in Siv Gimel is that we're talking about a proper door. We're talking about a door that's made out of multiple planks. And yet, va'afilu hachi machmerinon, and in Siv Gimel we're machmer, sheyeh kosher v'tali mi'ba'yon. In Siv Gimel we said that one of the factors that you need in order to be able to close that doorway up is that the door has to be tied to the structure in some way. So why is it that in Siv Gimel, where we're talking about a proper door, we say lamaisa, it does need to be tied to the house, and now in Siv Daled we're saying you have a proper door and a proper doorway, the door does not have to be tied to the house. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, it's very easy to understand why. Because in Siv Daled, we're talking about a frequently used doorway. In Siv Gimel, we were talking about the doorway that goes to the Rechava Sha'acharei Abatim. Over there, we're talking about the infrequently used doorway. With Svirle de Bazel loy be'inan kosher klal u'kamosha kasafti b'sif katan chavtes. The Mechaber is telling you is that the fact that over here in Siv Daled we're talking about a frequently used doorway, that's a major mitigating factor to the shaila of Tosefes Alabinyan. When you have a doorway that's being used constantly, there's much less of a fear that it's going to look like real binyan. But in Siv Gimel, we're talking about a doorway that's hardly used. So that's why over there we're more machmir, and we need a door that's tied to the house. Says the Ramah Viter, 3 lines off the bottom end of the line. He tells us about another type of door. Let me read the words, and then I'll explain what he's saying. When you have a door that's made out of multiple planks, again, let's go 3 lines off the bottom end of the line. So too, where they were accustomed to closing up a doorway using multiple planks, but they're not affixed together. These are not multiple planks, let's say multiple vertical planks, that have cross beams so that it's built into a door. This is just, let's say, 4 or 5 vertical planks that are separate. How do you close the doorway? V'yesh chakika, there's a trench, lamaila, up on top, ulamata, and on bottom, shemaktis behem akroshim, where you take the planks and you stand them up. So this is a case where you have an opening in the house. In the ground, at the base of the doorway, there's no askufa, there's no threshold. Instead, there's like a trench in the ground. And up on the top of the doorway, so let's say in the upper beam at the top of the doorway, there's a corresponding trench. You have 4 vertical planks. When you want to close the doorway, what you do is you take your plank, you shove it up into the trench at the top of the doorway, and then you shift it in place, and you lower it into the trench at the bottom of the doorway. And you'll take 4 planks next to each other, and that's the way you close up the doorway. So it's not even a door. It's multiple vertical planks that when you stand them all in position, it forms a door. Says the Ramah, that's also okay. You're allowed to do that on Shabbos as well. This has the halacha of a door, and you're allowed to close this on Shabbos, since the door is not one board. Now, what the Mishnah Berurah, what the Mechaber seems to be saying over here is, let's do the math. Let's see what the Mechaber said, and then let's fit this Ramah into it. Basically, the Mechaber told us a halacha over here. The Mechaber said, you have this doorway that's frequently used. You want to be able to close it. The Mechaber said in the beginning of this if the door is an atypical door because it's made out of one board, and the doorway is an atypical doorway because it doesn't have an askufa tachtoina, and the door is not tied or affixed to the house in any way, you're not allowed to close this. Why are you not allowed to close it? You're not allowed to close it because it looks like Tosefes Alabinyan. It's a real Tosefes Alabinyan problem. Came along the Ramah, and the Ramah said, okay, but if the door is a proper door, because it's made out of multiple planks, and it does have an askufa tachtoina, then you are allowed to close it, even if the door is not tied to the house. Now, says the Ramah, let's take a look at another case. You don't really have a door. You have multiple vertical planks. And you don't really have an askufa tachtoina. Not only don't you have an askufa tachtoina, in the place where the askufa tachtoina would go, what you have is you have a trench. So, and what are you doing? This really kind of, I want you to try to visualize this in your head. This kind of looks like baina. Somebody's coming with a vertical plank, and he puts it up into the chakika at the top of the doorway, then lowers it into position in the trench at the bottom of the doorway, and he does that with 5 planks. This doesn't look like opening and closing a door. Yet, says the Ramah, this is okay. Why is this okay? It seems because, one thing we see in the words of the Ramah says that dinam kideles, why? Hoyel ve'enon luach echad b'chal adeles. Because l'mais, it's not one board. Construction, it seems, the Ramah is saying, if you were doing construction to close up this breach, you would use a board. You're not using a board. You're using a bunch of planks. A bunch of planks, those are the components of a door. It's true it's not built into a door, but it's the components of a door. And there's no askufa tachtoina. It's true that there's no askufa tachtoina, but what is an askufa tachtoina? An askufa tachtoina is an elemental part of a doorway because you have a threshold that the door closes against. Well, over here, you might not have an askufa tachtoina, but you have a trench at the bottom of the doorway, which is clearly used as part of a mechanism to open and close the doorway. If you were doing construction and you were closing this up, why would you make a chakika at the bottom of the doorway? That's not the way they built walls of houses. The way they built walls of houses was not by digging a long trench and standing up planks in a trench. So why over here, in this 36-inch area where there's a breach in the wall, why is there a trench over here? Because it's part of a mechanism for opening and shutting a door. Therefore, says the Ramah, this is not problematic because it doesn't look like Tosefes al Habinyan. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cotton Lamadal, Viesh Chakika, Return Alarma, what the Ramah means to say is, Ta Chakika Nechsheves Ka'askufa. That, I believe, is what the Mishnah Berurah is telling you here. The Mishnah Berurah is telling you what the Ramah is saying is that, again, you need 2 factors. You need the door to be a proper door. You need the doorway to be a proper doorway. The Ramah told us how you have one. The Ramah told us that since the door is multiple planks, it's considered a door. Hoyel ve'enon luach echad b'chal adeles. But where's the askufa tachtoina? So the Mishnah Berurah fills in the gap. He tells us that the chakika that's in the place where the askufa tachtoina would normally be, that chakika is what serves as the askufa tachtoina. Oiskat Lamed Vav, Hoyel ve'enon, since Lamaisa it's not one board, Kvarkasav del El, the Achreidim betadidim lahakalaf beluach echad, came chiesh la askufa v'asi l'knisa v'tziyatadir. The Mishnah Berurah just points out over here that really, halacha lamaisa, we don't need both factors. We don't need the door to be made out of multiple planks and the chakika to serve as the askufa tachtoina, because we're learning like the Rambam, who says that the only time the mechaber's halacha applies, that you're not allowed to close this, is if you have both problematic factors. If you have the door is a luach echad and there's no askufa tachtoina. But if you have either one of the mitigating factors, if the door is krashim harbe, or the doorway has an askufa tachtoina, then it becomes mutter. So too over here in the case of the Ramah. If you're using multiple planks, then you don't really need the chakika. If you have the chakika, it could be even luach echad. So, to put this in real terms, let's say what you had is, you had the chakika where the askufa goes, and you have the chakika on top, and you take a plywood board, and you put it up into the top chakika, and then lower it into place in the bottom chakika, that would be okay. Because you have the chakika, which is the askufa tachtoina, even though the deles is also miluach echad. Okay. Moving on, now we go to the bottom line of Kufyut Chesed Beis Sif Hey. A little bit of not a new topic, but a different set of cases now. Now we're going to be talking about movable pieces of furniture. Until here, we were talking about Tosefes ala binyan. We're discussing the problem of making an addition to a structure, building something onto a house. We're worried that when you take this doorway, you're adding onto a house. Now we're talking about furniture. Says the Mechaber Sifei, Shida, Teva, Umigdal. These are different types of furnitures, chests, dressers, wardrobe units. So Shida, Teva, Umigdal, Shepischeyen men hatzad, that have doors and openings on their sides. I think the best way for us to visualize this is imagine a large standing wardrobe unit. Now, it can't be overly large. It can't be arba'im sa. Once it's 40 sa, it gets a din of mechuber. So we're talking about something medium-sized. You have like a little wardrobe unit that has a door that opens up on the side. Now, how does this door work? Says the Mechaber, V'yesh lahem shnei tzirim. The door has two pivots. Echad l'mayla, it has a pivot at its top. Ve'echad l'mata, and has a pivot at the bottom. Okay, so how does it work? So the door has a pivot on top, a pivot on bottom, and the piece of furniture has two corresponding holes. There's a hole at the bottom that the bottom pivot goes into, and there's a hole at the top that the top pivot goes into, and the door swings on the pivots. What happened? The door fell out of place. Says the Mechaber, Im yatsa hatachtoin kuloi b'mekoymai. If the bottom pivot comes completely out of its hole, says the Mechaber, Aser lahachziroi, you're not allowed to return the bottom pivot of the door into its hole. Why? Shema yiska, because we're afraid that you might come to affix it into place in a very tight fashion. Now, we'll explain this in the Mishnah Berurah. We'll see what's at play over here, what the problem is, but let's go a little further in the Mechaber first. But if the bottom pivot did not come completely out of its hole, somehow it came out partially, then says the Mechaber, Doichkai, you could push it so that it should pop back into place. Why? Because since Lamaisa, the top pivot, has remained in its hole, the door is still relatively in place. We're not talking about a case here where the door came totally out. If the bottom pivot came totally out, now you have to it's almost like you're reassembling it. That we're going to say you can't do. But if it came partially out, you could pop it back in. Because Lamaisa, it's still held in by the top pivot. We're still okay. Bekal yochel lahachzer atachtoin. In this case, you could very simply, very easily pop the bottom back into place. Avol kishayotza ha'elyon. But if the top pivot comes out of its hole, then you're not even allowed to push it back into place. So again, you have this little wardrobe unit of some kind. It has a door. The door swings on two pivots, an upper pivot, a lower pivot. The pivots are positioned in corresponding holes. Says the Mechaber, if the bottom pivot comes slightly out of place so that you could just push it back into place, you're allowed to do that. If the bottom pivot came completely out, then you're not allowed to put it back into place. Why? In the words of the Mechaber, we're concerned Shema Yiska. You might firmly reattach it into place. But, says the Mechaber, if the top pivot came out, game over. If the top pivot came out, you're not allowed to do anything. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Let's see what's at play. Says the Mishnah Berurah on Kuf Yutes Amud Aleph Eis Kat Lamed Zayin. Ve'echad lamata. You've got two pivots. One is at the bottom. Ve'yesh chor, and there's a hole. B'mifton, in the bottom of the bottom plate of the doorway. Sha'atzir nichnas l'soichai, that the pivot goes into. U'kenegdai, and opposite it, yesh lamayla, up on top, chor echad, there's another hole. Sha'atzir ha'elyain hu b'soich ha'chor, and that's where the upper pivot goes into a hole. The Mechaber said, if the bottom pivot comes out, if it comes out all the way, you're not allowed to put it back. And in the words of the Mechaber, the reason you're not allowed to put it back is Shema Yiska, because you might firmly put it into place. The Mishnah Berurah explains what that means. Shema Yiska b'choizik, you might put it back into place firmly, strongly. Besikin ubiyesedos, using pins, using pegs, aka screws, nails, shelo yuchal oid lotzes misham, because you want to make sure that it doesn't come out again. They have a makeh b'patish, and this would be a problem of makeh b'patish. So let's try to visualize what's going on here. You've got a pivot that goes into a hole, and the door turns on that pivot. You've got a problem that this pivot keeps on popping out. Says the Mechaber, if it came out completely, you're not allowed to put it back. Why? Because you're frustrated. This pivot keeps on popping out. You want to make sure that the pivot can't pop out. So what you might do is, you might take some pegs or something and use them, the way I understand it, use them to help fill up the gap around the pivot. It seems that this pivot, the hole, let's say we're talking about wood. So we're talking about a wooden hole. Over the years, the hole gets worn out. Once the hole gets worn out, it becomes very easy for the peg to come out. So what do you want to do? You want to take some pins, you want to take some nails, you want to take some pegs, you want to stick them in around the peg. You want to narrow the hole so that the peg becomes tight inside the hole. Now, obviously, you can't make it too tight because the peg has to be able to turn. But you've got a lot of leverage over here, right? And also gravity is holding that peg in the hole. So you could make it tight and still be able to turn it. But you might tighten it up b'chozik. You might do something that constitutes really attaching the doorway firmly into the hole. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what would be the problem of that? The problem of that would be makeh b'patish. What's makeh b'patish? Makeh b'patish is when you finish off a keli. This wardrobe unit is a keli. When you take the door and you firmly build, if you would be building this doorway, and now you're taking the door and you're assembling, you're doing the final step of assembling the wardrobe unit. So you're taking the door and you're properly and firmly affixing it into place. That's the finishing touch of a keli. That's makeh b'patish. It is a daraisa. So says the Mishnah Berurah, the problem over here would be a makeh b'patish problem. Now first, let's finish the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'afilu heichi sha'acharhu be'emtza pesach hateva. An interesting case. Till now, we're talking about a door that swings on two pivots. It swings on an upper pivot and a lower pivot. Now the Mishnah Berurah gives another case. I want you to imagine a square piece of furniture that has a door on its side. But the way this door works is, it doesn't swing open and closed on hinges or on pivots. No, the way this door works is, you remove it and you put it back in. How do you remove it and put it back in? Well, on one side, this is for Torah purposes, so I feel that you're allowed to do this. I'm using a sefer to demonstrate. Let's say this front cover, let's say this is the door. Over here, at the midpoint, there's a pivot. But not a pivot that's going to turn. So let's not call it a pivot. There's a peg. And the peg goes into a hole. Let's say there's a frame over here around the piece of furniture. And in the frame, there's a hole. And this pivot goes into the hole that's in the frame. So when you want to open and close this, what you do is, when you want to close it, you shift it at an angle, you take that peg, and you put the peg into the hole that's in the frame, and then you close it. When you want to take it out, you angle it, and you remove the lid. So this is not a door that swings open and closed. This is a lid that's held in place by a peg that's in the middle of the frame. Now, what the Mishnah Berurah is going to say is, in that case, there doesn't seem to be a real basis for a chashash shema yiska. We're not going to have a chashash that if the hole that peg goes into, you're going to take pins and stuff and you're going to make it firmly attached. Over here, you can't have it firmly attached because in this case, this lid is made to be removed and put back in, removed and put back in. So that peg that goes into its corresponding hole has to be able to slide in and out easily. By the pivot on the door, no. You want that pivot to sit in the lower hole. You don't ever want to take it out. You want it to be able to spin. You want it to be able to turn, but you don't want to be able to take it out, put it back, take it out, put it back. So by the pivot, there's room to have a concern of makabapatish, achshash shema yiska, that you might do something to make it fit in very firmly. But by this peg that goes into the middle, a hole in the middle of the frame, there doesn't really seem to be achshash shema yiska. So is there a problem over there? Says the Mishnah Berurah, yes. Says the Mishnah Berurah. ואפילו הכי שאחר הוא באמצע פסח הטבע דלא שייך למגזר כל כך שם יסקה, אפילו הכי אוסר תגזרינה באמצע אטו מן הצד. This would be a gzeira. We don't want you putting things back into the holes because of this gzeira shema yiska that exists with pivots on the bottom. Now, another interesting halacha over here. Some of these halachas are a little bit difficult because we don't know the facts on the ground exactly how their furniture worked. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah like this. Va'afilu b'tzirim shalanu shehem mi barzel. Even when it comes to our pivots that are made out of metal, Aser lahachser dalse akelim, you're still not allowed to put the door back onto the keli. The gazrinan shema yirish atzir ain't tekua yafeh v'yechaber oisoi b'masmerim. Literally, what the words mean. Let's read it again, and I'll literally translate the words, and then I'll tell you how I understand it. And this is a quote from a Magen Avraham. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "Afilu b'tzirim shalanu." Even when it comes to our pivots, okay, a tzir is a pivot. Even when we deal with our pivots, shehem mi barzel, where the pivot is not made out of wood, the pivot is made out of metal. Still, aser lahachser dalse akelim. You're still not allowed to put the door back onto the wardrobe unit. Why? Because you might see that the pivot is not firmly attached, and you might come to attach the pivot. The way I'm understanding this, and I've seen other Mefarshim that understand it this way, is like this. What the Chavetz Chaim is saying is, our furniture has metal pivots. Now, when you have a metal pivot, the hole that it went into sometimes was also a metal hole. So it was a metal pivot that sat in a hole that was lined with metal. It was like a metal cylinder. Now, over here, what's the problem? We said that the reason you're not allowed to reinsert the pivot into the lower hole if it came out completely is that because the hole wears out, you might do something to fill in the gap. You might take screws, nails, pegs, and do something so that the pivot fits tightly into the hole. But if you're dealing with metal, there doesn't seem to be a fear. It doesn't wear out. So what's the problem? Says the Mishnah Berurah, is still a problem because the concern is the opposite concern. The concern that Mechaber was talking about is that the hole might wear out, and therefore you might add pins and pegs to fill up the gap and make the hole tighter. By ours, we were talking about metal pivots and a metal sleeve. The problem, says the Mishnah Berurah, is you might find that the pivot, which is somehow attached to the wooden door, you have a wooden door with a metal pivot. How is the metal pivot attached to the door? Maybe the metal pivot is screwed to the door. If the bottom peg pops out, you might go and look to put it back in and see that the hardware is coming off the door. The metal pivot is coming off the door. So you might get a screwdriver and screws, and you might reattach the metal pivot to the door. Going to Mishnah Berurah's Cut and Limud test, the Mechaber said, Aval kishiyatza elyon. If by the bottom pivot, we said, it depends. If it only came out partially so that you could easily push it back into place, that you're allowed to do. If it came out completely, you're not allowed to put it back. But the upper pivot, if the pivot came out of the hole at the top, then you're not allowed to put it back in at all. Aval kishiyatza elyon explains to Mishnah Berurah, the problem is, dal yedei zehu noifel lagamri. When your top pivot comes out of the top hole, the door falls off. When your bottom pivot comes out of its hole, the door doesn't necessarily fall off. It's held in place at the top, and at the bottom, it's leaning against the bottom of the furniture. It's leaning against the bottom of the unit, so it's not going to fall off. But if the top pivot breaks or the top pivot comes out of the hole, then the whole door just falls off. And in that case, you can't even gently push it into place, because without you doing anything, it's going to fall off entirely. By you putting it back on, it looks like you're really rebuilding the keli, which would be a problem. Okay, let's move along to Sivav. I see we'll probably go a little bit over time, but we have to do Sivav. Says the Mechaber Sivav, 4 lines off the top. Kuf Yotes Amid Aleph, says the Mechaber. Mita shel prokim, a bed that's made out of many parts. Now, let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in mem. This is a mita shel prokim. What is this? Says the Chavetz Chaim. Hainu she'asuya prokim. This is a bed, a portable bed, that's made to be taken apart and put back together again. Hainu she'asuya prokim. Bishvil balei umnis, this was for traveling salesmen or traveling craftsmen. Sheyuchlu losei sitam baderech, this was a bed that they could take apart into parts, and they could carry it with them on the road. Ukishaban al mekaimam, when they came to their place of lodging, machzirin prakeha, they would put it back together again. Yachad u'moishivan isa. So this was a portable bed. It was a bed. They didn't have folding beds. Instead, they had a bed that was made out of many parts, and you pulled them apart, and maybe they had a nice carrying bag, and you took it with you, and when you got BYOB, bring your own bed. When you came to your place of lodging, you took your bed, and you put it back together again, and now you had a bed. What's the problem over here? Again, boine. Over here, or makabapatish. Now, I didn't get into this. There's a major machloikis, binyan bekalim. Like this, we usually say, ein binyan bekalim. The malach of boine does not apply to small utensils. Boina is on a house. Boina is on mechubal karka. Boina on small utensils. We don't have boina on small utensils. But we do have makib patish. When you put a keli together and you finish it, that's the issa daraisa of makib patish. That's what the Mishnah Berurah generally goes with. The Mishnah Berurah generally looks at these shilas as makib patish shilas. So you have a bed. It's taken apart. It's meant to be taken apart. Now, when you put it back together again and you build it into a bed, you can have a makabah patish shaila. So now, against that backdrop, let's see what the Mechaber says. Mito shel prokim, this bed that's made out of parts that are meant to be taken apart and put back together again, asur lahachzira ulahatka. You're not allowed to go ahead and reassemble it. Now, I have to pause here for a second. We just had the word here in the Mechaber, asur lahachzira ulahatka. And then if you look right away in the next phrase, it says, V'im toka chayev chatos. Toka means to put it together firmly. Now what we're going to see is there are 3 terminologies that we're going to be using. One term is lahatka. Lahatka means to connect, to reassemble, to assemble pieces together. But the implication of lahatka is that it's put together nicely, it's put together properly, it's not wobbly, but it's also not takua. Takua is when you put together something really tight, really firmly. It doesn't budge. Then there's going to be another term, and that's going to be refuya. Refuya means loose. Something that's refuya is something that's shaky. You put together the parts, but when the parts go together, they're shaky. They don't stick together and be firm. They're ruffly, they're loose, they're shaky, they're wobbly. We're going to have these 3 different levels of construction. Hiduk, which is kind of like the middle level, which is connected. Takua, which means really built firmly together. And rafui, which means loose. Against that backdrop, let's see this again. Mito shaprakim, so you have this bed of many parts that's made to be taken apart and reassembled. Asur lachziru lahatka. You're not allowed to reassemble this bed on Shabbos. V'im toka, and if you would actually go and put these parts together firmly, chayiv chatos. This would be an issa daraisa. It would be a chayiv chatos. What malacha would it be? Makabah patish. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah is cut mem aleph. Asur. So lahatka is asur. It's not chayiv. to assemble it is an Issa Darabanan. Why, says the Mishnah Berurah Cotton Mem Aleph, Gezerah Shemayiska B'Yeseidos U'Masmerim Dehevi Gemar Malacha. So take a look at what the Mishnah Berurah is saying. The Mishnah Berurah says to take the parts of the bed and to assemble the bed so that the parts are properly connected. That's an Issa Darabanan. It's not an Issa Daraisa. The reason it's not an Issa Daraisa is because even though it's properly connected, it's made to be taken apart. It's not built. It's not firmly connected. But there's an Issa Darabanan. You know why? Shema Yiska. Because we're afraid you might actually do a complete construction. You might decide to take screws and screw it together. Once you screw it together, it's a Daraisa of Makeh B'Patish. So you might go ahead and put it firmly together with pegs and screws or nails to have a gemar malacha, which would be a gemar malacha. That would be this deraisa of Makeh B'Patish. The yesh imrim, and now he brings down this yesh imrim that we mentioned before. He brings this down from the Magen Avram. The yesh imrim the kevet sha'isa b'zeh kli gomer chayiv mishum boide. Now he mentions the shita that holds that even though generally we say ein binyan b'kelim, but when you build something into a finished product, then there's binyan even b'kelim. V'ayin b'simin shin yudal sefalafu b'hagra sham, where this machloikis and how we apply the rule of ein binyan b'kelim is discussed in greater detail. I was going to read to you two Dirshu footnotes, 19 and 20. I don't have time. I would advise, if you want to see more about this shaila of ein binyan b'kelim and how it's applied, take a look at Dirshu footnotes 19 and 20. Okay, let's go weiter here in the Mechaber. So far the Mechaber said, you have this mita shel prakim, you have this bed, this portable bed, that's made to be disassembled and reassembled. Said the Mishnah Berurah, Aser lahatka. There's an Issa Darabanan to go ahead and reassemble this bed on Shabbos. It's only an Issa Darabanan. What's the Issa Darabanan? Gezerah Shema Yiska. We're afraid that if we allow you to reassemble it, you might come to really firmly, permanently assemble it with screws and nails. That would be a Chiyuv Chatos. That would be an Issa Daraisa of Makeh B'Patish. Now continues the Mechaber, 4 lines off the top near the end of the line. Ve'im darka lihiyos refuya. But if we're talking about a construct that never goes together tightly. So I want you to imagine, you have one type of portable bed that when you assemble it into when you follow the instructions and you assemble it, it's meant to be very sturdy. When you follow the instructions, you put this bed together, it's a nice, firm, steady bed. It doesn't wobble. The pieces fit together tightly. Over there's an Issa Darabanan to assemble it, because since it's made to be firm and to be tight, we're afraid that you might come to go the extra mile and actually put in screws. Now, you could especially see such a fear. Let's say it's a construct that when you follow the instructions, it's supposed to be nice and firm. So your expectation when you put this bed together is that you're going to put it together, it's going to be nice and steady and firm. Now you go ahead and you put it together, and it's not nice and steady and firm. Why not? Well, maybe it's 10 years old, and maybe you've taken it apart and put it together 3,500 times, and the holes are worn out, and now it's not so firm. But since your expectation is that it should be firm, you might go ahead and get a screwdriver and screws and make it firm. So over there we understand very easily that since the expectation is that it should be tight, there's a gzera, I'm not going to allow you to put it together, Shema Yiska. But what if it's a construct that never had an expectation of being tight? Maybe it's v'imhi darka lihiyos refuya. What if it's a construct that's never tight? This is a lower level, it's not a premium 5-star portable bed. It's a low level, cheap portable bed. And, when you go to buy it, the guy in the store tells you, listen, this one is $25. This one is $200. This one, you put it together, you get a good night's sleep. You don't feel like you're sleeping on a portable bed. This one is a portable bed. You roll over in the middle of the night, it's shaky. So if it's darka lihiyos refuya, then, says the Mechaber, mutter lechatchila, then it's mutter to put it together, But what does that mean? It's mutter to put it together. Says the Ramah, ubelvad shelo yahadek. Since it's derech liyos refuya, since it's made to be loose, so the expectation is that when you build it, it's going to be loose. You're allowed to go ahead and what? You're allowed lechatchila to go put it together. You're allowed to assemble it. But what level of assembly? Only refuya. Only the expected level of assembly. It's expected to be refuya. Fine, you could assemble it and allow it to be refuya. But says the Ramah, ubelvad shelo yahadek, you can't bring it up to the middle level. You can't decide it's dark liyos refuya, but I'm going to make it tight. That you can't do. Because now already if you're working to make it tight, now we have to make a gzeira shema yiska. Now we're afraid you might go the extra mile and get a screwdriver and screws, and you might come to yiska, which would be an issa d'oraisa. So now we have to put in place the issa d'rabanan shaloi lahadka. So again, in the first case over here in Sivav, you're talking about a bed where the expectation is that when you put it together, it's tight. That you're not allowed to assemble on Shabbos. Gzeira shema yiska. The second case is there's no expectation of it being tight. It's dark liyos refuya. Okay, then you could put it together ba'ofer refuya. You could put it together if it's loose, and that's mutter even lechatchila. But also lahatka. You can't go ahead and put it together tightly, because once you're working to put it together tightly, then the gzeira shema yiska is going to kick in. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois cotton members, ve'imi darka, if it's meant to be loose, the shovei lochish klal shebiyave liskaya, then we have no room for a gzeira achshasha shema yiska. It's made to be loose, so you want to put it together loose, gives a date. But mem gimel, but the Ramah said, ubelvad shelo yahadek. The roughly, the ena roughly. Also, the Mishnah Berurah says also, if it's kind of like borderline, if you're putting it together and you're making it somewhat tight, that's also a problem. Continues the Mechaber on the same vein, 5 lines off the top, near the middle of the line, by the Ois Cut Mem Daled for the Mishnah Berurah. Another similar case. The kais shall prokim. A kais, a cup that comes apart. Says the Mishnah Berurah Cut Mem Daled, the kais shall prokim. What kind of kais is this? Sheyesh kais shemefarkin oisai me'al ragloi. There's a kais that has a stem and a cup, and the cup comes off the stem. So again, it's a portable cup. You pop the cup off the stem and you put it into your briefcase. Says the Mechaber, v'kais shel prakim, a kais that's made of parts to be taken apart. Mutter lefarkai ulahachzirai. You're allowed to take it apart and put it back together again b'Shabbos. Why? Explains the Mishnah Berurah. You know why? Because of the halakha that we just learned. Memhei leparkai ulahachzirai kishehu rafui. You could put it together loosely. V'atam, and the reason is de'ein derech lahadek kol kach b'chayzik sheyeh chashuv k'moy tekiah v'al kein lachu shema yiska. The Mishnah Berurah explains the reason this is mutter is because of the halakha that we just learned. The kais shel prakim was something that was expected to be loose, so therefore you could put it together because there's no expectation of it being tight. So there's no room for chash shema yiska. Now, before we go further in the Mishnah Berurah, let's go further in the Mechaber. The yesh misha omer, but there are those that say shedina kais kedina mita. There are those that say that this loose kais shel prakim has the same halacha as the mita shel prakim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'hayesh misha omer sfirle kevan dal kol panim derech lahadek. There was a question of how to look at this kais shel prakim. Do we look at the kais shel prakim that this is what the Ramah would call something which is darkoi lihiyos refuya? Was this kais shel prakim something which was expected to be so loose that there's no room for gzeira shema yiska? Or no, the kais shel prakim was something that often went together tightly enough that there's room for an expectation that you might try to make it really tight. So, it is the derech to put it together somewhat tightly, gamba roughly also, so it's even also to put it together loosely, like by the mita shel prakim. Kasav Magen Avraham, the Magen Avraham writes, the kaisai shaladu ha'asuyim b'charitzim saviv. They had a type of kais where the top screwed onto the base. The types of cups that have a screw, samach l'raglam, near the base, umuhudakim b'chayzik, those go together tightly. So l'kulei al-maser. So then it's also to put that together. Again, any time that there's an expectation that something is going to go together tightly, you're not allowed to assemble it on Shabbos because of Gzeira Shema Yuska. V'kisei ha-kelim. Now, how about covers of kelim? So you have a container that has a screw-down cover. V'kisei ha-kelim afilu asuyim ka'achshari. By a container that has a screw-on cover, there's no shaila. We're not going to say, oh, you're doing makabapatish. You're screwing on the cover tightly. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why not? The hasam ein asuyim lekiyum, because the top is not meant to stay on. Rak lepaschan or lesagran tamid. It's made to open and close. A lot of people, I think, misunderstand this Mishnah Berurah. They think that what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, the reason there's no shiloh over here is because it's not made to be permanent. It's made to be put on. The cover is made to be put on and take off, and put on and take off. So what? The koshel prakim is also not permanent. The koshel prakim is also made to be assembled and disassembled and assembled and disassembled. That's not what the Mishnah Berurah means. What the Mishnah Berurah means is, remember, according to most, and the derech that the Mishnah Berurah seems to go with, the ikar problem over here is makabapatish. So you want to tell me that when you take a koshel prakim, so you have a base and a stem, that's not a cup. Now you take the cup part and you screw it on. I could see a makabapatish. You just made a cup. Before it was not a kais, now it is a kais. So I see room for a makabapatish shaila. A mitel shel prakim. You have this portable bed that comes apart. Okay, before it was a stack of parts. Now you built it into a bed. Now it's a bed. I see the shaila of makabapatish. Container with a screw-on lid. When you screw on the lid, is there shaila makabapatish? Guess what? When the lid is on the container, you can't use the container. You can't put anything in, you can't take anything out. You didn't finish the container by putting on the lid. It was a container, it is a container. And in order for it to be a functional container, you need to be able to take the lid on and off. So it can't be a shiloh over here of makabapatish. Okay. Ta-da. The Chay Kazavataz. Vafila Kalim Shasal Parkanag. Ziran tangential halacha, says the Mishnah Berurah. Okay. So let's say we're talking about a keli that you're not allowed to reassemble on Shabbos. B'kamakayim letaltal on shari. They're still not muktzah. So let's say you have this kais shel prakim. You have this kais that's meant to be put together, and let's say it's the kais that screws together, which the Mishnah Berurah said everybody would agree you're not allowed to reassemble it on Shabbos, right? So you might think that now it becomes muktzah. Why should it become muktzah? Because of a halacha that we learned earlier. We learned halacha that by a menorah, some kind of a candelabra that was meant to be put apart, taken apart, put together, it's muktzah. Why is it muktzah? Because we're afraid that it might come apart and you might come to put it back together again. So since we're afraid that if it comes apart, you might come to put it back together again, it's also betiltal. How about this kais shel prakim? Is it also betiltal? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. B'kabakam l'taltal and shari. It's not muktzah. It's mutter betiltal. V'lagazru ela b'menorah shedarka lehisparek k'mar shekazav seisim in reisha intes v'chal kiyotzabay avadav shein darka lehisparek shar betiltal. It seems that this menorah was something which was commonly taken apart, put back together, taken apart, put back together, and I guess the kais shel prakim, it wasn't as common to take it apart and put it back together again, so that we should be afraid to make it also betiltal on Shabbos. We had the more machmir opinion who said that the kais shel prakim is treated like the mitel shel prakim because lamaisa the kais shel prakim goes together tightly, so there's room for the chashash shema yiska. Says the Mishnah Berurah lachatchila yesh lahachmir k'dei azu achibu l'tzar Shabbos yesh l'smach hadei rishona. The machmir opinion compares the kais shel prakim to the mitel shel prakim. Says the Mishnah Berurah an interesting thing. V'hu adin ashtender shebebeis hakneses shemunacham alav sfarim. The Mishnah Berurah compares the type of shtenders that they had in Radin, in the shul, to the kais shel prakim. We don't know what kind of shtenders they had. It sounds like what the Chavetz Chaim is saying is that they had a type of shtender which went together more on the loose side. imhu shel prakim. And the Mishnah Berurah is saying that the din of the shtender is like the din of the kais. What's the din of the kais? The Mishnah Berurah said we should be machmir like the more machmir opinion. What's the more machmir opinion? The more machmir opinion is that if the shtender was something that lemaisa went together somewhat firmly, then you're not allowed to put it together on Shabbos because we're afraid Shema Yiska. Okay? I don't know exactly what kind of shtender he was talking about, but I'm going to show you something. Let me first do the final Mishnah Berurah, but then don't turn off. Even though it's overtime, and I'm telling you that we're doing the last Mishnah Berurah that we're doing today, don't turn off because I have a little bit of a visual presentation that I want to show you about the shtenders. Ois kat memkes lihiyos mehudak. The Ramah said, if the koshel prakim is something which is meant to be put together tightly, so that even if now you put it together loosely, you're still not allowed to put it together because it's the expectation is that it should be tight. There's a concern, Sheba Yiska. What the Rama wants to say is, if the expectation of this Kaishal Prakim is that it's going to be put together tightly, even the Tur would it's like the cup that screws together. Where the Mishnah Berurah said over there, the expectation is that it should go together tightly. If the expectation is that it should go together tightly, then you're not allowed to put it together on Shabbos because there's Xera, Shema Yiska. Now that brings me to shtenders. So this shtender that I have here is a common type of shtender nowadays. I'm going to pick it up here for a second. So this shtender has an adjustable top. By loosening or tightening this screw over here, basically this leg is a hollow tube. This tube fits into the lower tube. This adjusting screw fixes it into place. By loosening this screw and loosening the one on the opposite side, you could raise the top of the shtender by extending this tube further out of the lower tube. Or you could lower it by pushing it in further. Are you allowed to adjust this on Shabbos? So, my thought would be that there's absolutely no reason why it should be usher. There's no makar b'pata shayla here, it's already a shtender. It's already put together. All I'm doing is adjusting the size. Not only that, what are you going to tell me? Maybe if I loosen the screws, maybe the top will collapse all the way down into the bottom. So what? Even if this collapses all the way down into the bottom, I still have a perfectly usable table. All I do is do this. Now it's nice and flat. When it's lowered down all the way, it's about table height. I still have something perfectly usable. It's still a perfectly usable piece of furniture. So I don't see any shaila here at all when it comes to adjusting the size of the shtender. But let's talk about another problem. Let's say you go ahead and you loosen these adjusting screws all the way, and you actually take the top and you pull it all the way out of the lower tubes. Are you then allowed to reassemble it? That's mamish what we're talking about in this sif. You know what this is? This is a shtender shel prakim. This is a shtender that's assembled of two parts. And they easily go together. You could put it together and take it apart. So would you be allowed to put this together on Shabbos? I think not. Why? Because this is darkei lihiyos mehudak. I want to put a heavy Gemara on this. Not only do I want to put a heavy Gemara on it, I want to put a heavy Gemara on it, and then I want to learn on it, and I want to lean on it. So I'm putting my weight on it, which unfortunately is a little too heavy, and I have a heavy Gemara on it, and I shakeltzach on it. I don't want it to collapse. So this is darkei lihiyos mehudak. If I put it together and I find that it's loose, now there's a shaila. Maybe I'll go in and I'll take a screw and I'll shoot in a screw, which would be a daraisa of makar b'patish. So here we have a very contemporary case of mamish this sif. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be banging against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua's for first panasat sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zayich to see the BS called Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu amen. Be well.